So, are we all addicts in some form or another? And basically, why? And when I say that, we all have different like drugs of choice, if that makes sense. So, where am I going with this? Is a book called Dopamine Nation by Dr. Anna Lembke. I'm gonna assume how you say her name, but here's the cover. It's actually really good book. I've actually gone through it a couple times already, and she has a workbook along with it too. But basically, let's start off with defining the problem, right? So basically, what is this book about in her own words, and how she's starting it off with is it's about the relationship between pleasure and pain, and how understanding that relationship has become essential to a life that we live nowadays, especially with, I mean, if you think about it, like the human race was pretty much, like especially a long time ago, even millennia ago, excuse me, you know, we needed to always be hitting something in order to survive, whether that be finding food or water or whatever. There's a lot of scarcity, but that's not a problem anymore. So now basically we're seeing this, I don't want to say archaic, but this older like psychological characteristic of human nature, and it's creating problems now because our environment has completely changed. So to go back to the book, she says scientists rely on dopamine as a kind of universal currency for measuring the addictive potential of any experience. The more dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, the more addictive the experience. One of the most remarkable neuroscientific findings in the past century is that the brain processes pleasure and pain in the same place. So further, the pleasure and pain work like opposites of a balance, kind of like a seesaw is where she's getting with that. So whether that be basically craving another piece of chocolate, a good book, movie, video game, whatever, all the way up to like cocaine, crack, actual like legit drugs, that we kind of tend to think of them as, right? So she says that the moment of wanting is the brain's pleasure balance tipped to the side of pain. And we'll get more specific into that later when we get to those chapters. Basically, she uses this book as kind of a lot of the stories in this book are true in terms of the story itself. It's just the names and identities of the people have changed, so to protect them, as you normally have, and that you have to have with like HIPAA and that kind of stuff. Anyways, some of them may be shocking, just if you guys get the book too, which I highly recommend. Like I said, this is my second time going through it, and I also got her workbook as well that my wife and I have both been working through and discussing and that sort of thing. And the reason for that is because we all engage in behaviors we wish we didn't, or to an extent which we regret, right? And so in essence, the secret to finding balance is combining the science of desire with the wisdom of recovery, and basically using like kind of like the stories of severe addictions to learn the lessons and apply them to your own life so you can be more productive with your time, whatever the case may be for you, right? Because it's going to be different for everybody. My biggest thing with my things, excuse me, is better uses of time. Dang. All right, so the first part is the pursuit of pleasure and kind of like understanding that part. This part is more familiar for a lot of people, I think, but to start off with, the first chapter is our masturbation machines. So, and it starts off with the story of a dude who makes a machine. He's a scientist for himself to do that with. And he becomes extremely addicted to it. He can basically stay in that state for hours. And at one point, later in the book, he talks about one time how he did it for 20 hours straight, which I couldn't even fathom. But she introduces this concept of like a double life, to where like to quote what exactly she means, it refers to the addicted person's secret engagement with drugs, alcohol, or other compulsive behaviors, hidden from view, even in some cases from their own. Basically, they have their life with their drug of choice, and then without, to where like that's where they have their family, their job, and that sort of thing. And they always try to keep those separate. So the person who she names him Jacob for the case of the book. the one who makes his own machine, right? And he's actually talked about, like, he's used throughout this book a lot. But like, to take his own words, he swore he would stop, and he hid the machine high up in a closet or dismantled it completely and threw away the parts. But a day or two later, he was pulling them down from the closet or out of the trash, and only to reassemble them and start all over. So basically, like, this constant coming back to it, not being able to get away, and needing that period. So to continue, she talks about how, like, repulsed you may be by this, and this is where she starts to get into our own versions. And what I mean by that, to continue, she says, perhaps you regard it as a kind of extreme perversion that is beyond everyday experience with little or no relevance to you or your life. But if we do that, you and I, we miss the opportunity to appreciate something crucial about the way we live now. We are all sort of engaged in our own masturbation machines. And then starts to talk about her own story where she was in her 40s, roughly, pretty settled into her career, doing pretty well. Kids are starting to get out of the nest, and so she started kind of empty nesting and developed an unhealthy attachment to romance novels. And she starts to talk about her own version where she gets ever cheaper options all the way down to very cheap and terrible books, and basically just completely consumes her life, right? So, like, she basically talks about how she no longer cared about the syntax, style, scene, or character of the books. She just wanted a book to read. She just wanted to hit. And to the point to where she would literally just, like, skip. She found out if you just go, like, 3/4 of the way through, you get straight to the point. She just read the climax and pick another book because there's so many of them, right? And so that's kind of the first part to where she's really starting to talk about this. And another point she makes, and why this is a big thing for today, is the fact that, like, it's so easy. And part of the reason why some things can become so addictive, and you could have compulsive overconsumption, the term she uses a lot, is that based, like, the internet and technology today, it's like she compares the smartphone to the hypodermic needle. Like, we're basically shooting up heroin. Not literally, but that's kind of the comparison. And later on, we'll get into, like, how the dopamine spikes change, because this is looking to be a pretty long video. So if you need to take breaks, as always, let me know when you guys need to take breaks too. Because I'll just start talking. Like, I can't even realize it's already 8 minutes in. But anyways, so to back on topic, the internet promotes compulsive overconsumption not merely by providing increased access to drugs, old and new, but also by suggesting behaviors that otherwise may never have occurred to us. Videos don't just go viral. They're literally contagious, hence the advent of the meme. And where she started this was a story, basically, of two little brothers, like less than 10, both of them. And basically one of the older brother assaulted the little brother in a very not safe for work kind of way. And the police, when investigating this, were basically like, like, a lot of the times when they see those behaviors or something like that happen, it's because one of the parents or some adult had done that to the older brother in this case, and they didn't find anything about that at all. They just found out that he found this stuff on the internet and wanted to try it, right? And this kid's like maybe 8. Anyways, to continue and get some actual statistics on this. So, talks about how, to quote, we are all at risk of titillating ourselves to death. I think that's my favorite quote in the whole book. But for some stats. So 70% of world global deaths are attributable to modifiable behavioral risk factors like smoking, physical inactivity, and diet, leading to global risks for mortality. The leading global risks for mortality are high blood pressure, 13%, tobacco use, 9%, high blood sugar, 6%, physical inactivity, 6%, and obesity, 5%. Obviously, there's some correlation there, but also, like, if you You know what? I'll hold off on that because I'm getting too far ahead of myself with the book. What I was about to say was basically connecting all of those in a way, but it's going to be easier once we get through more of the book. So with that being said, global deaths from addiction have risen in all age groups from 1990 to 2017, with more than half the deaths occurring in people younger than 50 years of age. Right, so pretty young. And to close out this first chapter, basically she calls all these deaths, no, she doesn't. The Princeton economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton did a study, and basically, in the end of this, the top 3 leading causes of death in middle-aged white Americans without a college degree. They're dying younger than their parents, like all previous generations for there, but those 3 leading causes are drug overdoses, alcohol-related liver disease, and suicides. And they call this the deaths of despair, right? So what do we tend to want to do because of this? Because now we kind of know what the problem is and kind of what's going on, right? And so what do we tend to do from that? And for that, I guess I should rephrase this. Why are we doing this? And so her next chapter is running from pain, to where she talks about the pursuit of personal happiness has been a modern maxim, crowding out the definitions of the good life. Even acts of kindness towards others are framed as a strategy for personal happiness. Altruism, no longer merely a good in and of itself, has become a vehicle for our own well-being. So basically, like, everything's kind of looked at through the lens of, like, you know, you have to be happy. Like, that's the meaning of everything. And I think I've said this in some of my very, very beginning videos. Like, that's something I've disagreed with for a while, ever since I started, like, actually studying and reading throughout college, like, actually trying to understand this kind of stuff, is, you know, like, the meaning of life is not happiness. But that's an opinion of mine. Anyways, to continue, so talks about how this is pretty much everywhere we look. So messages exhorting us to pursue happiness are not limited to the realm of psychology, right? She says modern religion too promotes a theology of self-awareness, self-expression, and self-realization as the highest good. So there's that. Goes into parenting and education causing the same kind of development. So she says, yes, we should acknowledge every person's worth independent of achievement, stop physical and emotional brutality on the schoolyard and everywhere else, and create safe places to think, learn, and discuss. But you also have to not over-sanitize, as she says, over-pathologize childhood in raising children in basically the equivalent of a padded cell, at least psychologically, with no way to injure themselves, but also no means to ready themselves for the world, right? Which would kind of lead, basically, like, starts going on about how, you know, keeping kids, and at least psychologically, in kind of like a padded cell in this form, like keeping them safe like that, they don't learn basically the psychological skills to actually deal with pain and stuff that they're gonna have to, they will go through as an adult. And so they'll start running towards a lot of those more addictive behaviors as a cover up. They're running away from the pain, if that makes sense. Everyone does it, but to different degrees, if that makes sense. And at any point I say something that you guys don't agree with or whatever, put it in the comments, because the whole reason I'm going through this kind of stuff is to put it out there, for one, and for two, my own kind of understanding and synthesizing the information, because it gives me a deeper understanding, and two or three, whatever number I'm on. This wasn't part of my outline for the video, but you know, the whole point is just to discuss this stuff and actually make a difference. But anyways, talks about, what was I going to talk about this? Yeah, we're all running from pain, and starts to talk about like the history too. So prior to the 1900s, doctors believed some degree of pain was healthy. Leading surgeons of the 1800s were reluctant to adopt general anesthesia during surgery because they believed the pain boosted the immune and cardiovascular response and expedited healing. And then basically talks about the lack of evidence for both sides, and then called the paradigm shift around pain has basically to where like now there's so much pain medicine nowadays, and like the whole point is running away from it. So the paradigm shift around pain has translated into massive prescribing of feel-good pills. Today, more than 1 in 4 American adults and more than 1 in 20 American children take a psychiatric drug on a daily basis, right? So like not only like is our whole world and our worldview like revolving around the search for pleasure and happiness, but we're all given the opportunity to run away from that pain as well, right? So now we get into the balance part of this thing. So because remember in the beginning how we talked about how basically, pain and pleasure have a large overlapping area of the brain in which that they I guess are processed or whatever. They happen in the same area, right? So, more on dopamine so we can kind of understand this better. But dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in reward processing. But neuroscientists agree it is among the most important. It may play a bigger role in the motivation to get a reward than the pleasure of the reward itself. So dopamine is more for wanting more of something rather than liking it, if that makes sense, right? So it's kind of like, and she talks about some rats to where basically they did something, genetically engineered mice unable to make dopamine. They won't seek out food and starve to death on their own, even if it's just placed like inches within their mouth in some experiments. But if food is placed directly in their mouth, they'll still chew it and seem to enjoy it, however you measure the pleasure of mice. But it might be an interesting article to actually like look up and find in some archives or something. But to continue, so the more dopamine a drug releases in the brain's reward pathway, a brain circuit that links sorry for anyone who knows anything about brains, who links the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex, and the faster it releases dopamine, the more addictive the drug, right? So the more we can get these spikes, okay? So it starts talking about like basically actually giving numbers to this. So having for example, a rat in a box, and they would measure the dopamine levels as they give certain things. So for basically everything is based off of a basal rate, something like that. Basal output, which is basically baseline. So what happens when they would give the rat chocolate, it increased by 55% above baseline. Sex was 100%, nicotine 150, cocaine 225, and types of amphetamines was at least 1,000 above baseline. Talking more about like its co-location for the pleasure and pain side of the brain. Same location, same area. But neuroscientists have determined that pleasure and pain are processed in overlapping brain regions, like we said before, and they work via opponent process mechanism. Another way to say this is basically they work like a balance. And she gives pictures and how she basically describes this with neuroadaptation is where you're on the balance and you do something pleasurable, chocolate, gaming, whatever, and then basically you tip that to that side of the balance, and the human body and the brain always wants homeostasis, right? And so it's going to start loading up on the pain side of things to try to level it down, but there's always going to be a little bit more, and so it's going to dip down to the side of pain again soon at some point as your dopamine decreases, and then basically that's when you're coming into that wanting, like I want to do it again and so on. But to continue and not get ahead of ourselves. So with repeated exposure to the same or similar pleasure stimulus, the initial deviation to the side of pleasure gets weaker and shorter, and the after response to the pain side gets stronger and longer. And this is what they call neuroadaptation. Basically, you need more of the same drug of choice, whether that be video games, food, exercise, whatever, actual drugs, whatever the case may be, to get the same effect, right? So basically, and that needing more of it is what tolerance is, right? You're building tolerance towards whatever this substance is for you, right? Let's see. So now we get into some interesting parts. So the pleasure-pain balance is triggered not only by re-exposure to the drug itself, doing it again, but also exposure to cues associated with it. So going to like AA talks about people, places, things that remind you for AA, like to drink or whatever, because this is a general phenomenon itself. So in the world of neuroscience, they call it cue-dependent learning, which is basically the same as your classical form of Pavlovian conditioning, right? The dog are hearing the bell ringing type stuff. So there's that. So this is all of this 20-something minutes has been about like the problem, what it's for, like what are we doing, sort of thing. Like what exactly is kind of happening to us. So how do we kind of fix it, right? Because remember, we're only a third of the way through the book. This might be a long one, but I've been actually trying to study and learn this stuff too. So, but I did kind of skip a bit more further on. So, self-binding. Before we get to that, she takes the her biggest thing is she takes dopamine, the actual word, and basically makes it into a kind of template to help you do like a dopamine fast. Basically get over an addiction, like abstinence, right? So let me get to the letters. I wrote it down somewhere. Anyways, but for example, D stands for data. Basically like making data on this and everything. O stands for objectives. Like what was the whole point of you trying to do this behavior? What were you actually trying to fix? P is the problem. What problems arose because you were doing this behavior or doing this drug, whatever the drug is, whatever it happens to be. A stands for abstinence, and this is actually doing the abstaining from doing this behavior, right? M is mindfulness, trying to be mindful the whole time. And I'm just kind of running through these. If you want like help actually doing this or understanding it more to the depth that you kind of need to actually be able to do the dopamine fast or like get over the addiction, especially like minor addictions and so on. Like you play video games too much or whatever. And it's kind of going into ruining your life in a way. Get the book. The workbook's really helpful too. I've been working through it as well. I'm just not bringing it up because I haven't not bringing it into the video because I haven't finished it. But anyways, I stands for insight, like actually understanding everything. Because a lot of the times you don't realize something's a problem unless you kind of abstain from it. And then like maybe a week later, you're just like really craving it. N is for next steps. So what do you do afterwards? And the E at the end is experiment. Like experiment with ways to like actually have this behavior or whatever in a healthy manner. Now, like if that's like hard, like opioid drugs, maybe just if the experiment is don't do it again. Depending on whatever. I don't know. I've never done it, so. But if it's like playing video games or like like sex with your spouse or whatever it happens to be. How you can't just cut those out or it's a food addiction. That's probably a better thing I could have said. But if it's like a food addiction or something, then like, you can't just not eat. So experiment with like, how do you create a healthy way to do this? To not go to Steak and Shake every Wednesday night because you're sad after some class or work sucked or you have a weekly meeting then, I don't know. Then like how do you create a healthy thing with that? And that's where you start to get into self-binding, basically ways to prevent yourself from continuing to do this, to help you with the fast too. So before we get into that, excuse me, dang. She talks about dopamine transmission. I wanted to bring this up. This is part of abstinence, right? It's the A, and why, and because you have to abstain from something for a certain amount of time. So basically, they noticed with certain, like most like decent addictions, 2 weeks of abstinence is not enough. Basically, you're still in a dopamine deficient state. So as you keep hitting the button, with whatever the case may be for you, that baseline, that basal output, after each time you do it, or after prolonged use and repetitive, the whole baseline comes down, which is where you get into dopamine deficient states, and then you get into major depressive disorders and that sort of thing. She gives examples of that as well. I'll leave that part for her to explain more in depth. Again, because this isn't an audiobook, it's kind of more of a discussion. But to continue, this part was something I noted during the next steps part of things. So she says the vast majority of her patients who were able to abstain for a month, 4 weeks to a month is basically the time frame. She noticed that for the majority of things clinically, it was able to more or less reset that basal output, kind of like baseline for dopamine. For most things, obviously, like, and she talks specifically too, like, like if it's a legit problem, like if you're gonna have, like if you are a major alcoholic or on like heavy opioids or whatever, and there's legit health concerns from you going cold turkey, like go to professionals and get help, sort of thing. But a month is typically what she notices is great for abstinence, and for most things, to where there's not going to be some major health rebound, I guess, for just cutting it out. But basically she says, but they want to use differently than when they were using before, and basically they always want to use less. So it helps them get a more, abstaining from a month kind of shows them what's going on, and it also kind of helps reset the kind of the dopamine levels for that person, so where they can actually like use less or have a more healthy relationship and no longer be like addictive to everything. So there's that. And now we get into self-binding, which, as she defines, is an intentional way of basically intentionally and willingly creating barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice in order to mitigate compulsive overconsumption, right? So basically this is, she puts these in 3 broad categories, which are space, time, and meaning. Space being physical strategies, time being chronological strategies, and meaning being categorical strategies, where you can get into like religion and so on, but we'll get more in depth right now. So physical self-binding, so it's one form of self-binding that to create literal physical barriers and or geographical distance between ourselves and our drug of choice, whether that be like asking a hotel to take the TV or the mini bar out of your room before you show up, or you physically putting stuff into a cabinet and locking it and the key's not in the house, or whatever it is, right? Creating some form of actual barrier between you and what you want to get to, making it very difficult for you to get that. There's that. She talks about Odysseus, from the Odyssey, and basically with the sirens putting the wax in his ears, or with the crew put the wax in the ears, and basically he was tied to a post, sort of thing. Another form of physical self-binding. But basically, she talks about how you could also do this, like, for example, this is where she starts to get into, like, food addiction sometimes, too. It talks about, like, surgeries and stuff you could get, which are an example of that. Like a gastric banding, sleeve gastrectomy, and gastric bypass sort of things. Those are more modern examples of that. Next, there's the chronological self-binding, which is the time. So by restricting consumption to certain times of the day, week, month, or year, we narrow our window of consumption and thereby limit our use, right? So sometimes rather than a time, we could do it based off milestones or accomplishments, like whenever I graduate, I can do this again, or whatever the case may be. I can only do this on weekends, whatever, right? Those are just examples. Next is meaning. So to define categorical self-binding, so it limits consumptions by sorting dopamine into different categories, subtypes basically, that allow ourselves to consume and ones that we're not, right? So this method helps us to avoid not only a drug of choice, but also triggers that lead to our craving of the drug. The strategy is especially useful for substances that you can't eliminate altogether, like trying to consume in a healthier way, like food, sex, and smartphones, right? You can only eat dessert on special occasions or whatever. That's chronological. But anyways, those sorts of things, right? So basically you're placing a behavior into different categories. Like I can do this basically when it's this kind of situation versus like I can do this with my spouse, but I can't do this alone, sort of thing. That could be an example, right? So there's that. She also, for true addicts and so on, you could be asking right now, like, like what if that balance that we talked about earlier is broken, period, like it no work no more. She talks about I've always been horrid at pronouncing drug names. Buprenorphine, wow, buprenorphine, but basically, let me get to it. I'm trying to pronounce it, not even there. I got ahead of myself, but that's fine. But anyways, talking about basically the prescription side of things, like where can you get actual drugs and so on that would help you come off of things or live, period, with your addiction, or coming off of it. And she does talk about, I think she called him Chris, who was heavily addicted to opioids for over a decade. And basically like, nothing worked, period. And he would take what I tried to say earlier, the buprenorphine, maybe that was closer, but basically that was the only way he could function, was with that sort of stuff. Without it, like he literally couldn't. And so like his wife had to deal with, like maybe he's not as emotional all the time as she would like him to be, but like he's not shooting up in the bathroom or whatever. I don't know. So to continue, prescription stimulants are the molecular equivalent of street methamphetamines. And she says Ice, Speed, Crank, Christina, No Dose, and Scooby Snacks with an X. And then second, basically talking about like, what if these drugs don't actually work the way they're supposed to, or worse, they make psychiatric symptoms worse in the long run. So talks about although the buprenorphine maybe was working for Chris, the evidence for psychotropic medications more generally is not robust, especially when taking long term. So like, yeah, it could help people come off of stuff, but like, is it okay to give this to people for the rest of their life, sort of thing? And like the studies, it takes a long time to get those kind of studies because people have to literally live their whole lives with it, right? But she says patients with anxiety and insomnia who take, benzodiazepines, I don't know, broken line. Anyways, examples like Xanax or Klonopin, and other sedative hypnotics daily for more than a month may experience worsened anxiety and insomnia. Patients with pain who take opioids daily for more than a month are at an increased risk not only for opioid addiction but also for worsened pain. And recent data show that even antidepressants previously thought not to be habit forming may lead to tolerance and dependence and possibly even make depression worse over the long haul. A phenomenon called tardive dysphoria. Right? Now, before everything starts going haywire with what I'm talking about, basically, like, like how these medications that are given to a lot of people can just make everything worse. That's a possibility. But one thing she notes is, in medicating ourselves to adapt to the world, what kind of world are we settling for? Under the guise of treating pain and mental illness, are we rendering large segments of the population biochemically indifferent to intolerable circumstances, right? Are we basically just numbing everybody? But to note, all of what was just said is kind of negative about those drugs and so on. And I'll quote specifically from her because they're her words. In the whole argument, it's in her book, She's the Doctor sort of thing. I can't even pronounce the names. Like, I'm just learning about this stuff. So she says, please don't misunderstand her. These medications can be life-saving tools, and she's grateful to have them in clinical practice. But there's a cost to medicating away every type of human suffering. As well as we shall see, there's an alternative path that might work even better. And she says, embracing pain, which is the third part of the book. I just kind of want, because I said all of that stuff that could be negative towards those drugs, that like the prescriptions that you get from a doctor, which like thoroughly and legitimately help people completely change their life, right? And this is a concept that I say all the time in pretty much every aspect of it too. It's like, like look at all the sides, and kind of like the whole point of these videos are for discussion, right? It's the same thing. Like, yes, these medications are life-saving tools, but like there's a cost to it, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be, or it's not necessarily all good. It can be very good for some people in some cases, sort of thing. Like they're not all good and all bad, is all I'm saying. But the pursuit of pain, right? This is the final part of her book, kind of like the other side of the balance, right? With that being said, she talks about doing so. So scientists at Charles University in Prague, writing in the European Journal of Applied Physiology, apparently at the 40-minute mark or so, I start to not be able to pronounce words that I wouldn't have been able to pronounce anyways. But they conducted an experiment in which 10 men volunteered to submerge themselves head out in cold water for an hour, and this water was below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And so then they would take their blood and show the plasma dopamine concentrations, and show that after the ice baths, they increased 250%. And the plasma norepinephrine concentrations increased 530% as a result of cold water immersion, so ice baths, right? Other studies examining the brain effects of cold water immersions in humans and animals show similar elevations in monoamine neurotransmitters, so like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, the same neurotransmitters that regulate pleasure, motivation, mood, appetite, sleep, and alertness. So beyond neurotransmitters, extreme cold in animals has been shown to promote neuronal growth. All the more remarkable since neurons are known to alter their microstructure in response to only a small handful of circumstances, right? And talks about ground squirrels, basically where they'll hibernate in the ground and basically have their neurons would grow at such a rate after they started to warm up after hibernation, just freezing in the ground, where they're basically their body temperatures are at freezing, that basically the the growth occurs rapidly and basically only it's like on par with the neuroplasticity that you see in like embryos, sort of thing. A cool little quip, I guess. But to continue, not all about squirrels. She says, pain leads to pleasure by triggering the body's own regulating homeostatic mechanisms. So the same thing we talked about in the beginning of the book with our own behaviors, like pushing down on the pleasure side of the scale or the balance, pushing down on the pain side also has our body try to push down on the pleasure as well, right? So the same thing happens on both sides. So with intermittent exposure to pain, our natural hedonic set point gets weighted to the side of pleasure, where your body's always trying to like push down on the pleasure side, such that we become less vulnerable to pain, build a tolerance to pain, and more able to feel pleasure at the same time. So we're becoming numb to pain and more, I won't say open, but more like sensitive to pleasure, rather than before with our own addictive behaviors and so on, which like we're using to search for pleasure. It's doing the opposite. We're becoming numb to pleasure and more sensitive to pain, right? All things that like the environment of our current world with the amount of or lack thereof of scarcity of things that we truly need, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, kind of lends to that as well, right? So I did warn you guys this was going to be a long one. Now we're talking about hormesis. We're almost done though. So hormesis is a branch of science that studies the beneficial effects of administering small to moderate doses of noxious or painful stimuli such as heat, cold, gravitational changes, radiation, food restriction, and exercise. Excuse me. And then he talks about an American toxicologist named Edward J. Calabrese, where he's quoted in one of his publications that adaptive responses of biological systems to moderate environmental or self-imposed challenges through which the system improves its functionality and or tolerance to more severe challenges. What doesn't kill you make you stronger in science talk, basically. So go to the gym and don't be a prick. I don't know, that's my own motto. Anyways, to continue, we're almost done with this. So scientists have shown that stress alone can increase the release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, leading to the same brain changes seen with addictive drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine. Just as we become tolerant to pleasure stimuli with repeated exposure, so too can we become tolerant to painful stimuli, resetting our brains to the side of pain. Kind of what I was talking about earlier with the balance stuff. There's that. And I will make a comment after this. So she closes out this chapter with, if we consume too much pain or in too potent a form, we run the risk of compulsive destructive overconsumption. So that addiction can happen with pain as well. And that's where you get into like masochism and so on. That sort of stuff. But if we consume just the right amount, inhibiting great pain with little pain, we discover the path to hormetic healing and maybe even the occasional fit of joy. So one thing I'll kind of know, she talks a little bit about this in here too, is not to become addicted to pain as well. Like trying, again, like healthy relationships with both sides. That sort of thing. So now we talk about radical honesty, which basically telling the truth is painful, as she says. We are wired from the earliest ages to lie, and we all do it, whether or not we care to admit it. So children begin lying as early as age 2. The smarter the kid, the more likely they are to lie, and the better they are at it. The average adult tells between 0.59 and 1.56 lies daily. So 1 to 2, basically. But there's an explanation for this. So she talks about, the evolution of Homo sapiens culminated in the formation of large social groups. Large social groups were possible because of the development of sophisticated forms of communication, allowing for advanced mutual cooperation. We can talk to each other, and teamwork. Words used to cooperate can also be used to deceive and misdirect. The more advanced the language, the more sophisticated the lies. Politics. Lies arguably have some adaptive advantage when it comes to competing for scarce resources, but lying in a world of plenty risks isolation, craving, and pathological overconsumption. And then goes on to explain. 6 talks about that. This is where we talk about kind of awareness, and we talk about Odysseus again with the sirens. Basically, like, the sirens could only be killed if whoever heard them could live to tell the story afterwards. And then basically Odysseus was able to vanquish the sirens by narrating his near-death voyage after the fact. So the slaying was in the telling. Basically, being radically honest can become addictive as well, is what she kind of gets into. This kind of myth is a key feature of behavior change. So she says, recounting our experiences gives us mastery over them, whether in the context of psychotherapy, talking to an AA sponsor, confessing to a priest, confiding in a friend, or writing in a journal. Our honest disclosure brings our behavior into relief, allowing us in some cases to see it for the first time and actually understand it, right? And then starts to go into denial. So denial is Denial is likely mediated by disconnect between the reward pathway part of your brain and the higher cortical brain regions that allow us to narrate our lives, appreciate consequences, and plan for the future. So many forms of addiction treatment involve strengthening and renewing connections between those two parts of the brain, right? Because everything's connected. And then talks about a study basically where they're playing like a little card game, and one of the people, they could lie about what card they had and still win. And they tested this basically. There's more to the experiment, but for time's sake. But basically they found that lying went down by half when neural excitability in the prefrontal cortex went up. They would measure prefrontal cortex activity. And so basically for that conclusion, they said that honesty can be strengthened by stimulating the prefrontal cortex, consistent with the idea that the human brain has evolved mechanisms dedicated to control complex social behaviors, which is preventing that social isolation, overconsumption, and craving that she talks about in the very beginning of the chapter, right? So to say this, basically consistent with the lived experience of people in recovery, telling truth may even change the brain, allowing us to be more aware of our pleasure-pain balance and mental processes driving compulsive overconsumption, and thereby change our behavior in the first place. That's why the honesty is a part of the dopamine acronym and a part of the workbook and stuff to actually, change your behaviors and what you're doing. So there's that. Now we skip a big chunk she closes this chapter out with basically what her patients taught her with this, right? So her patients have taught her that honesty enhances awareness, creates more satisfying relationships, holds us accountable to a more authentic narrative to where we're not in denial and lying to ourselves about what's happening, and strengthens our ability to delay gratification. It may even prevent the future development of addiction because you never kind of get there in the first place. And when you are, it kind of helps rein you back. This is where we get into pro-social shame. So what is that? The psychological literature today identifies shame as an emotion distinct from guilt. So shame makes us feel bad about ourselves as people, whereas guilt makes us feel bad about our actions while preserving a positive sense of self. Shame is maladaptive, guilt is adaptive, right? So basically, she has a problem with this definition. And she says basically because like when you're in the experience, it's the same thing. They're identical. Yeah, afterwards you can parse between like self-loathing and like, I'm a good person who did something wrong versus I'm a bad person, right? But in the moment of feeling shame or guilt, a gut punch of an emotion, the feeling is identical. Regret mixed with fear of punishment and the terror of abandonment is one thing she says. And this is basically where she gets between the two different types of shame. So the shame-guilt dichotomy is tapping into something real. She believes the difference is not how we experience the emotion, it's how others respond to what we did. Right? We did something, we're shameful or guilty. How are others responding to it? So if others respond by rejecting, condemning, or shunning us, then we enter a cycle of destructive shame, which deepens the emotional experience of shame and sets us up to perpetuate the behavior. Whereas if others respond by holding us closer and providing clear guidance for redemption or recovery, we enter a cycle of pro-social shame, which mitigates the emotional experience of shame and helps us stop or even reduce the shameful behavior. I guess reduce or actually stop the behavior. Where she gets with this is two stories. One is basically a lady in a church. She gets addicted. She's a She's a doctor, some medical technician or whatever whose life isn't going too well. And so she basically starts taking Ambien. She knows how to get herself high from it, and she does it. She talks, but she's always gone to church. She's done well. She started talking to the church elders about it, and basically like they completely shunned her. And then she left the church and nobody ever contacted her again. No one cared, nothing. She says, I haven't been in a month, and do you know, no one has seemed to notice, no one called, no one contacted her, not even one person, right? And basically, it turns into this destructive shame, which is basically like, starts with like overconsumption of something, in this case Ambien for her, or whatever your case may be, which turns into shame about the overconsumption, and then you lie about it, and then basically everyone else kind of shuns you or whatever the case may be, and then you start to become isolated, and and then when you're isolated, that compels you to overconsume again, and so you're just stuck in a circle. Of overconsumption, shame, lying about it, and basically being shunned from whatever group or acceptance or whatever you need, right? On the other hand, she basically uses AA, and that kind of group to where it's like everyone is like they've all overconsumed, they were all shameful about it, but the difference isn't they're not lying about it, they're being radically honest about it, hopefully. And therefore that leads to acceptance. Yeah, you messed up, but this is how we can fix it, And theirs, where like basically it gets out of that circle because you're being accepted. You're no longer getting that kind of reinforcing stimulus to overconsume, if that makes sense. And so instead of going for overconsumption, you're more of going towards belonging and decreased consumption because you're being accepted about it. But that's all predicated on you being radically honest about it. Is basically where she's getting at. So there's that. And that we shall close out with, she gives Lessons of the Balance, which is just 10 pieces basically about the lessons throughout the whole book, and kind of like, I don't want to say like a snapshot, but a small, it's not 240 pages like the book is of the lessons you need to learn from this. And honestly, I think I'll leave that there. I'll just say that it's there. You have to buy the book to get it. No, you can probably find it online too. But also, the first one is the relentless pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain only leads to pain, right? Well, leads to pain. I added the only, but it's all right. But yeah, that's pretty much the book. With that being said, here's a cover one last time. Obviously, I studied it a bit and talked a little about it. I don't think I've yet to make an hour-long video almost. My throat kind of hurts, which is a first. But, yeah. As always, there's book reviews up there in the top, I think, right corner whenever it starts playing. But I've done a similar book called ADHD 2.0. I've done a couple videos on that one. What I learned from it, like a review, and I also did kind of a more in-depth version with my wife talking about it because she knows a lot more about this stuff than I do. She has more experience with it than I do as well. So there's that. We did like a 30-minute video or something like that, but I might put both of those as cards in one of the corners for you guys too. Trying to learn more about, like, not necessarily just psychology, but like, how all this stuff works. Just be a better person and not be a prick, I guess. Not that I tend to be, but as like the little second part of the title for this book, Finding Balance in an Age of Indulgence, right? So there's that. Anyways, I'm going to leave this one here. As always, a link to the book is in the description as well. I don't have enough subscribers at the time of this posting or anything to like put links like that up anywhere. But I always put the links to the books in the descriptions for you guys so they're easy to find. That sort of thing. Comments and so on. I wouldn't mind hearing your guys' story or things you've heard or any comments whatsoever about these topics at any point in this video. It'd be greatly appreciated. Or like some of the words I couldn't pronounce, like the drug names or whatever. If you have any experience with that, could you tell me more about it? Because there wasn't a whole lot of information in the book, but it'd be an interesting read. But anyways, I'm going to leave this one here. So I hope to see you guys on the next one, and have a good day.